1 year on from the invasion of Ukraine, Russia is gearing up for its next phase of escalation. I spoke to former US Army Infantry Commander and RAND Associate Director Jan Gentile about how Russia will approach its next offensive.
They've already launched their counteroffensive, and it seems to be focused in and around the Bakhmut area, and then north of it along the Kremenina-Svatov line. It's hard to say which one of those two is their main effort. My hunch is that it's the Bakhmut, is because Putin has said, the objective is to, gain control of all of Donetsk Oblast. And so if they can break through Bakhmut and then they have the road networks, then that would allow them to proceed to the west, the western province line. I don't think they're going to be able to do that for a whole bunch of reasons. They haven't demonstrated the ability to do any kind of combined arms operations. The way they've been fighting in Bakhmut is with lots of, I don't even know if I'd call them infantry. Infantry assumes a certain level of training. I mean, with the Wagner group and the conscription of prisoners and just sending them forward. But I do think Bakhmut is where their main effort is at, and I think that what they're doing to the north of that, between Kremenina and Svatov, and a little bit farther north, is more of a way just to hold Ukrainian forces in place. The only means they have of gaining ground is doing that, is leading forward with people, guys with guns, not well trained, to draw fire. And once they draw fire and they're killed, then someone sitting behind them can see, oh, there's a Ukrainian position there, let's bring a lot of artillery. That might work to be able to gain a foothold or even all of Bakhmut. But going any farther than that, because the Ukrainians have defensive positions to the west of that.
The West is set to provide tanks, ammunition and more weapons to aid Ukraine in its defence. It's yet to be seen if this will be enough to hold off Russia's next advance.
It appears that the Ukrainians are trying to keep hold of Bakhmut and defend there. And it appears, based on the large numbers of new weapon systems, infantry fighting vehicles, Bradleys, mortars from the U.S. and Germany, tanks, Leopard tanks, Challenger tanks, eventually M1A1s. Also, other NATO countries have contributed other types of tanks. So it sure seems that the Ukrainians are looking to put together an offensive mechanized striking force. Now, where they choose to launch that offensive, I don't know.
It's been 1 year since the invasion began, and things haven't played out as Putin has expected. The Russian leader appears to be banking on Western solidarity wearing thin, but the next 6 months could hold more surprises and prove pivotal.
There's been a couple surprises for this war. One was how badly the Russian military performed, especially initially. How much better the Ukrainian military responded initially and then throughout the war. But I think another surprise, especially this must have been a surprise to Putin, was he was banking on just that. Hey, we're going into Ukraine. NATO countries will freak out. They don't want another major war. They'll separate. They'll all have different views on it. That hasn't happened. And even though public opinion polls show support to be dropping somewhat, the alliance is still there at the political level. I mean, between NATO, other partner nations, and the U.S. What happens 6 months down the road, because I do think the next 4 to 5 months are going to be decisive in terms of, once we get to the summer, I think we're going to have a view as to the long game for this war. And then I think we'll know more about the possibility of negotiations.
This week, Vladimir Putin again reminded the West of Russia's nuclear capabilities. As Russia becomes more desperate to make gains, could the use of nuclear weapons be a realistic possibility?
I mean, that certainly has long-term implications for NATO-U.S. Security. But in the near term, I think it's Putin again, laying down, hey, I've got nukes. Don't forget it. It's hard to see, and I think Putin knows this, it's hard to see what the use of a tactical nuclear weapon does for him somewhere in Ukraine. I mean, he could put it down somewhere, but his senior leadership, military leadership in Ukraine has not shown the ability to be able to capitalize, because the whole idea of using tactical nuclear weapons is to be able to hit an area potentially where the enemy's concentrating, which then allows you a window, so to speak, a movement corridor, to be able to either move through, move around, or do something based on the shock effect of the use of the tactical nuclear weapon. I don't think the Russians have that capability, so it's hard to see what that gets them. And then if he does use a tactical nuclear weapon in that regard, then the next question is, how does NATO and how does the US and the rest of the world and Putin's few remaining allies like India and China respond to the first use of a nuclear weapon in combat since August 9th, 1945? I mean, I think the bigger concern would be escalation and Putin being willing to take a risk and throw a big part of his air force that's still largely 80% intact into the fight if he sees Ukrainian success in different areas and wants to do something to try to stop it. I think that's a more likely and a more actually worrisome possibility. I think that I do think that the war will end in some kind of negotiated settlement, like the Korean War did. But now is not the time for negotiations. The battlefield is going to determine the shape of those negotiations. I think 4, 5, 6 months down the road, there's a number of possible outcomes. One could be the Russians try their offensive like they're doing now, it fizzles. The Ukrainians try theirs, it fizzles, and then we have a stalemate, and that can produce a certain set of negotiations. Another possible outcome is that the Ukrainians have significant success in their offensive, create a serious shock effect of the Russian army in Ukraine, which causes at least parts of it to break up. And then what happens then, and the negotiations that leads to, that's hard to know. But I don't think we're going to see this kind of combat at the levels we're seeing right now for an extended period, 2 to 3 years down the road. I just don't. It could be like I said, both offensives fizzle. Both sides realize they got to come to some kind of armistice like you had on the Korean Peninsula, somewhat similar, or it turns out differently. But again, I don't see what's happening now staying for the next 2 to 3 years. Something's going to give in the next 6 months, I believe.
However this next phase of escalation plays out, the next 6 months could prove critical in deciding the outcome of this war.